So I'll start off by saying right away that I'm famous for usually overrunning with my presentations, which, as we're already running a bit late now, I hope you brought some sleeping bags and a tent, because we might be here a little while. Now, I'll try to keep it within reason. Also, my slides that I'm going to be showing here, they're already online, and it's a very complete slide set. There is a lot of information in there. It's a bit of a knowledge dump. I will probably, some of the slides just jump over, not dwell too long on the slides, but please go and find the slides afterwards if it interests you. There is a lot of depth to the slide deck, so I'll hopefully just give you a little bit of a flavour of the information that is in there, but for actually understanding some of those concepts in detail, it may be better if you kind of take it in your own time. So, and with that, let's move on. So this presentation really, it's nothing to do with accessibility. I work for an accessibility consultant. There's only a few mentions of accessibility. It really is, it started off when I was still working at Opera, working for particularly mobile development, etc. And a lot of conferences that I went to started with, I'll just jump ahead and I'll move the mouse pointer. Started with questions from developers that I would get after presentations. Which really boiled down to, now we have touchscreen devices, I'm a developer, I've not had time to really look into the details of what I need to do. Are there any specific things that I need to be aware of if I want to make sure that my website works on a touch device, a device with a touchscreen? So that set me off about 2 years ago on a path that involved loads of testing and everything else, which is all included in here. So the answer in general to this particular question is, in general, you don't need to do anything specific for touchscreen. If you've got a website, and it's a fairly simple, regular website, a few links, maybe a form or two, in general, it will work all right on a browser on a touchscreen device, because these browsers on touch devices are actually designed to run the web as it is today. And even today, there's still a lot of websites that rely almost exclusively on things like mouse-specific handling, or they have JavaScript hanging off, mouse over, click events, etc. And of course, these browsers on touch devices are designed to actually run these sites, so they will run reasonably okay. There will be a few problems, and we'll look at them in a minute. But in general, you don't need to really understand anything specific for touch devices. As a quick example, and this is one of the many tests that, since I don't have a life, I've spent the last 2 years doing on various devices. So if you've got a simple button, I'm just listening to whatever events are being fired, and I can see that, yes, even on a touchscreen device, I tap on it, and I get the mouse events that I would expect. I get the classic, mouse enter on some devices, not all of them, but I get mouse over, mouse move, mouse down. In some browsers I get focus, and then mouse up and click. And these events are being fired, you tap on a button, as soon as you release your finger, they're fired in rapid succession. So if I've got a website or web application that is designed to listen to any of those to actually do something afterwards, it will work okay-ish on touchscreens, because these events are actually being fired by design. It changes slightly. This is, the previous one was a clean tap, so the first tap. On the second tap, the event order is slightly different, purely because it assumes that, say, the first time around it has to set the focus into that particular button or whatever it is. Second time around, it assumes that the virtual focus is already there, so when you tap again, you won't get the mouse enter, for instance, and that sort of stuff. And if you tap away, in some browsers, you'll get a blur event or a mouse out event as well. So again, no big secrets there, but these events are being fired. So this emulation works in most cases, but it is also very limiting, and it can be quite problematic in certain situations. 2 cases that I'm going to be looking at. There are a few more. A big one that I'm definitely not got time to cover is hover-based interfaces. But 2 of the ones I'm going to touch on is delayed event dispatch and the fact that mouse move doesn't track on a touchscreen device. So the first one, delayed event dispatch, you possibly have come across it already if you started doing any stuff with touchscreen devices. So again, the classic, we've got the button, we tap on the button, and there is a click event. In this case, I'm only listening to a click event. It is being fired, but there is a delay. Sorry, I thought I had a slide that shows it. But it says there's about a 400 millisecond delay. In general, it's about 300 milliseconds between the time that I lift my finger again from the touch screen and the click event is actually being fired. So that can be a little problem, and we'll get back to that in a minute as well. And the second one, the fact that mouse move doesn't track. So, and here I'm going to attempt the demo gods. It can all go wrong from here. And this is actually a touchscreen laptop, which saves me doing any kind of remote debugging or AirPlay or that sort of stuff. So here is, this is the extent of my programming capabilities. That's why I don't get employed anywhere else. This is a little canvas experiment. You move the mouse around, and wherever the mouse goes, it pops these bubbles. That's cute. But if I now use touch, you'll see that it doesn't normally track. I'm starting to trigger things like the going back in history in the browser, and only when I really kind of do a single clean tap and move away, something happened. And that's because, as part of the event sequence that we saw before, of the various mouse events that are being fired, there is a single mouse move that is generally being fired when you tap and release on the screen. But as I move my finger around, the mouse move that I'm listening to in this example just isn't firing, which obviously, not every website has this kind of funky 70s wallpaper generator in the background, but if you're doing something like that, you'll find very, very quickly that on a touch device, that doesn't quite work. Okay, that's the example. So, to actually, cover those problems, and there's many other problems that I'm not even touching on, we need to go a little bit deeper. And to do that, we need to look at what are called touch events. Now, touch events were introduced by Apple, well, they were invented by Apple, and introduced with the first version of iOS. That was the day when iOS was set to, there's not going to be native applications, everything's going to be web apps, and then they quickly changed that idea because they realized they couldn't make any money from that. But yeah, Apple introduced that, and it was quickly adopted in all other, or the majority of other browsers on a touchscreen device. So Chrome had it, Firefox, Opera, etc. And then it was retrospectively specified at the W3C as the touch events specification. What the touch event spec gives us is a whole new series of events. You get touch start, the finger has touched the screen. Touch move, the finger is moving around the screen while it's touching it. Touch end, the finger is released. And touch cancel is a bit of a weird one. That is in general fired when a touch gesture has been interrupted. Now that in theory is, I'm in the browser, I'm doing something, and say a native dialog from the browser or from the OS itself has popped up. In that case, touch cancel should be fired at the web page to basically signal, touch handling's been interrupted for whatever reason. There were also touch enter and touch leave at some point. That was a Firefox specific thing, I seem to remember, but that didn't make it in the final spec, and no browser, as far as I know, submits them. Where do these events fire? Again, my very tedious little tests. If we touch the button, and I'll see in the next one, we'll see it a little bit better. The events that are fired, you'll see are, as I said, touch start, maybe a touch move if my tap wasn't quite clean, I've got a bit of shaky fingers because I've had my coffee in the morning or something. Touch end when the finger is released, and after that you get all the mouse compatibility events that we saw before. Now the mouse events are only fired if it's a single tap. As soon as you start putting two fingers on a touch screen, for instance, it doesn't fire any of these mouse compatibility events because it assumes that there will be some kind of gesture happening, and gestures don't normally fire mouse events either. Again, slightly different event order if it was the first tap or the second tap on a touch screen. But in general, this is kind of the lay of the land. We'll get the touch events first, and then we get the mouse compatibility events. There are a few kind of special caveats to look out for. If there's too many touch moves, so if my finger touches the screen and I start moving it a little bit too much, the browser will assume that it's not a tap per se, and it will not fire mouse compatibility events at the end because it doesn't interpret that as being an actual tap. That should fire the mouse down, etc. and click. And there are also too many touch move events in certain browsers immediately fire a touch cancel because it does assume that I'm starting to scroll or various other gestures, it fires that. But in general, browsers are reasonably okay with this kind of stuff. Some browsers fire the touch move not at all, or in slightly weird order. But in general, it stays the same. But there are also browsers that do outright weird stuff with the event order. So if you look at things like, not even that old browser, the default browser on Android 4.3, it does a weird thing that it fires mouse over, mouse move, and then the touch events, and then mouse down, mouse up, and click. And for the 10 people in the world who've got a BlackBerry Playbook 2, I'm one of them, it does something really bizarre. It does touch start, then a few of the mouse events, then touch end, and then some more mouse events. Kind of the takeaway from this is, yes, I'm sad enough that I've been doing all this testing on various devices, and my test results are actually online as well, if you're really that sad. But the takeaway really is, in general, we know what the theory is of the order in which these events are firing, but don't get too hung up on exactly following, this needs to happen first, then that. It's a very fluid kind of scenario. Some browsers do very strange things. As I said, all my results are also online if you want to have a look at them. So we know that there's touch events. We've seen before that there are problems if I just listen to the mouse events, the mouse compatibility events that are being fired. How can I use touch events to kind of overcome some of these problems? Again, delayed event dispatch and mouse move doesn't track. So delayed event dispatch, we've seen that I tap on a button, I'll release the finger, and after 300 milliseconds or thereabouts, depending on the phase of the moon or what day it is, it then fires the actual click event. Now, why is that 300 millisecond click event delay actually there? Well, there are a few reasons, but in general, it's because of double tap to zoom. Because on a touchscreen device, with a single finger, we usually do quite a lot. We don't only activate things, we scroll, that's fine, But also, there is a gesture, which is pretty common in all browsers, which is double tap to zoom. Now, if I tap and release the finger from the screen, the browser at that particular point doesn't know, was that a tap to activate something? Or is this just the first of a double tap gesture? So what the browser does in general, and it's pretty much almost all browsers do that, it waits, and it's usually around 300 milliseconds to say, okay, well, the finger left the screen, I'm going to wait 300 milliseconds. If there's going to be another tap, I know it's a double tap to zoom. If it doesn't receive another tap within that time frame, it assumes, okay, that was the user actually wanting to, click that button or follow that link, and then it will start firing the mouse compatibility events and the click at the end. So 300 milliseconds isn't a long time. I wouldn't say it's a dramatic problem, and most websites in general, users are used to that particular delay. It's not a deal breaker, but if you're doing something that is like a web application and you're trying to be almost native in how you respond to the user input and everything else, it does feel a little bit sluggish. It doesn't feel as responsive as, say, a native application. So developers have worked a lot on trying to optimize this away and hide it. So what would happen if browsers didn't wait those 300 milliseconds? Well, we know that they wait to see, well, is this a double tap to zoom? There is a bizarre browser, it's not popular here, it's called Puffin on Android. It seems to be popular in Korea. That's one of the few browsers that I've come across that doesn't wait 300 milliseconds. Yay. But then you do something like you double tap on, say, that test button, and it both zooms and activates that particular button, which is probably not what you want to get. A slight zoom in and all the mouse events and the click as well. Nobody's going to go and install Puffin, but for the lols, you can also enable this in Chrome as part of one of their kind of experiments and see how you go. Basically, in most sites, if you are somebody who uses double tap to zoom, you'll pretty much end up activating things when you just intended to zoom in. So there is a valid reason for that delay in most cases. Now, when does that particular delay actually happen? We know that it's, if I'm listening to click, it generally is 300 milliseconds after I lift the finger. But where exactly in that sequence does it happen? So again, I ran some tests, as I'm a sad guy, and basically this is, I don't know if you can see that, this is what happens. You get the touch events, like I said before, touch start, maybe one or two touch moves, touch end as I leave the screen, then the delay, the 300 millisecond delay, and after that you get mouse enter, mouse down, blah, 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 and the click right at the end. So how can I make my website or web application feel more like a native app? I want to remove that 300 millisecond delay. Naive answer really is you can react to any of the events that happen before the 300 millisecond delay. Now, classically, if it's something like a game where you've got, I don't know, a spaceship, fire buttons, you want to react on touch start. As soon as the finger touches the screen, if you want to fire the rocket or whatever it is. And touch end in most other situations, which is, as soon as the user lifts the finger from the screen, you want to execute your JavaScript. Now, a quick interlude before we go into the heavier stuff is there is a feature detect to see if the browser currently supports touch of it. And can you actually see that? I can't judge the illumination. Wave at the back if you can see it. Okay, a few eagle eyes there, some with binoculars. That's excellent. So basically, there are variations, and some older browsers do some slightly weird stuff. But in reasonably modern browsers, you can do a feature detect like if on touch start in window, and at that point you know the browser supports touch events. Great stuff. If you're supporting older browsers, maybe something like Modernizer will help you kind of paper over some of the problems as well. So you've got Modernizer touch if you want to detect that particular thing. Now that's great, but that led to something that I still see quite often, which is a common performance trick that you still hear about how to make your website, mobile optimized. Which basically, in simple terms, means it does the test, my code does the test for, does the browser support touch events? If so, I'm only going to listen to touch end. Otherwise, I'm going to listen to click. Which, on the surface makes sense. We've just seen, if I'm on a touch device, I react to touch end, that's before the 300 millisecond delay. Everything's great. But it's based on a kind of misunderstanding of what that feature detection is actually detecting. Because what you're doing in that case is you're making stuff touch exclusive. If a browser reports, yes, I support touch events, you've immediately said, I'm not going to listen to click anymore, I'm going to listen to touch end. Basically this feature detect doesn't say this browser is running on a device that only has a touchscreen. All that says is the browser understands what a touch event is. And it might have been true for older devices. I'd say a few years ago, yes, the only devices that did support touch events were, an iPhone or an Android phone. But nowadays you get a lot of hybrid devices that have touch and mouse and keyboard and whatever else. The landscape is becoming quite varied. One of the particularly Windows 8 kind of range of devices, I've got one here myself. It is a laptop, yes, it's got a trackpad, I can attach a mouse as well if I want to, it's got a keyboard, but it's also got a touchscreen. Chromebook Pixel, same kind of thing, trackpad, keyboard, and a touchscreen. And not just laptops, here's a kind of big monster that you can put on your desk, it's like a 25 or 26 inch Dell all-in-one PC. So that has a touchscreen as well as the traditional mouse and keyboard. And it's not just something that's happened recently. Here's a venerable device, the HTC Hero from 5 years ago or something like that. Has a touchscreen, but it also has that little, I'm going to use my laser pointer this time. Yeah. It has a little trackpad thing, which was pretty crap, but an alternative way of operating the device as well. You get laptops that are running Android nominally, but they're actually with a keyboard and trackpad, sold as kind of laptops. And then it's not just devices that are, specific devices that are new or devices that you might not have heard of. There's also a way, say on Android, a regular tablet or a regular phone, you can actually pair devices with it. You can pair a keyboard or a mouse with these devices. So what happens in those situations? Well, if you're pairing a mouse to an Android device, you're reasonably safe if you made the assumption of I'm only going to listen to touch, because a mouse on Android emulates a touch. So if I move anywhere and I press the mouse button, it emulates a touch, which then in turn emulates a mouse. So it's a bit weird, kind of Inception style. But you are kind of safe. If you made that naive assumption of if it supports touch events, I'm only going to listen to touch end, That is still okay. Now for the 10 people of us with a BlackBerry Playbook, if you attach a mouse to that, it behaves exactly like a desktop device. And the mouse will only fire the traditional mouse events. Mouse over, mouse down, mouse move, mouse up, and click. This will be one situation where if you make that little feature detector and use that, you've immediately killed the possibility of somebody with a mouse and the Playbook to actually do anything with it. So all 10 of us will be really sad. Now, if you use Android and a keyboard, it behaves exactly like a keyboard. So if you're navigating, as you would on desktop, if you're a keyboard-only user, tab and shift-tab to move your focus around the page. It only fires focus, and then when I activate it, it fires click. Again, a situation where the naive assumption of I'm only going to touch end won't get you very far. iOS doesn't let you pair a mouse. It lets you pair a keyboard. But you can't do much with it. Normally, if you attach a keyboard to an iOS device, it will only be workable in the same situation where you get the on-screen keyboard on an iOS device, so when you're entering a URL, etc. However, there's a whole different class of users on things like iPhone, iPad, and various other devices like that, which are, say, blind or visually impaired users. If you're running VoiceOver on iOS, a blind user using their phone with VoiceOver, which is actually a really good experience, I'm told, and I've tested some of it myself. That is again a situation where you're basically moving, rather than being able to, well, you can, but you wouldn't see where you're tapping, but rather than tapping on a screen, you generally swipe left and right to do the equivalent of tab and shift tab. You're moving your focus around the page, and you double tap to actually activate. Now, iOS and VoiceOver, you're fairly safe. Again, probably as a kind of safety mechanism, it still fires touch events in that situation as well. However, if you move to Android and you're running TalkBack, which is the screen reader equivalent in the Android world, and you're swiping left and right to move the focus, double tap to activate, it only fires, it's kind of a weird hybrid of keyboard and mouse events. No touch events there. So again, that's another situation where just listening to touch end, you've immediately killed that user group. Well, not literally, but they can't do much on your side. Now, I ranted about this about a year ago on the Hacksmozilla blog, run by some gentleman there. But basically, as I said, the problem here is based on this fake assumption. Saying that a browser understands touch events is not equivalent to saying it runs on a device that only has a touchscreen and that they will only ever use a touchscreen. All you can say is, at that point, is the browser supports this event model. You can't draw any conclusions about, is it a tablet, is it a fridge that runs the internet, whatever. So, the takeaway from that is, don't worry about all the devices and how they do things differently, but it's about thinking in more input agnostic ways. Rather than trying to pigeonholing users and say, this is a pure touch user, or this user will only ever use a mouse, rather than doing touch or mouse or keyboard, it's more about thinking in all those terms. At any point, a user could, for instance, be on a device without any touchscreen, and they attach a second monitor. They've got a KVM switch, and they switch to a touch-enabled monitor. Or they might be on a phone with a touchscreen, and then they pair a mouse with it, or a keyboard. It's getting a lot more fluid and a lot more difficult to really categorize these users. And really, it's about being more agnostic rather than trying to determine a priori this user will only ever use touch. So generally, how do you deal with that situation? Say you've got a function, and you want to make sure that it runs in the various situations. Now, the simple thing is, instead of doing either touch end, say, or click, you double up your event listeners. You fire the same function in both situations. Now, the only problem with that is we've seen that even for touch, after the 300 milliseconds, the mouse compatibility events and the click are being fired. So, just like that, you're risking firing the same function twice, which might not be a problem, but depending on what you're doing, it might be. So, a little trick that's necessary is for touch stuff, you also want to fire a prevent default. Now, you can do it as part of the some function handling there, or you could do it separately already on touch start. You could say, I'm handling touch stuff, and you fire the prevent default. And what you're saying with prevent default is to the browser, don't do what you do by default. Don't do your normal stuff, which includes firing the mouse compatibility and the click event at the end. So with that little line, you're basically avoiding that click is being fired after the touch as well. Now again, being careful, prevent default is quite a heavy hammer that you're putting down, because you're not just saying don't fire the mouse compatibility events, you're also effectively saying to the browser, I'm handling everything, which includes scrolling, zooming, etc. So if you just apply that to the entire page and just be done with it, all of a sudden you have to completely re-implement zooming, scrolling, etc. yourself, and nobody's got time for that shit. So the advice really is apply it carefully. If you're just doing all of this exercise, doubling up events, just to get rid of that 300 milliseconds to make your buttons a bit quicker, sure, apply that, apply it only in the case of the buttons. Don't apply it to the entire page and kill basically everything on the page that the browser will do by default. There is a nice ready-made script. It covers a lot of edge cases, because all of this stuff is the ideal. There are certain versions of Android, certain versions of iOS. Different browsers handle these things slightly differently. There's a ready-made script, fast click, something that you drop in your page, add a class to the things that you want to basically make fast, to remove that 300 millisecond delay, and you can forget about it. And it's quite good. It covers pretty much all the edge cases. And browsers are actually working on removing this delay, because if you kind of start looking into this topic, there is so much discussion on various developer forums, etc., about how can we remove this 300 millisecond delay. It seems to be the most important problem in web applications today. So browsers are aware of that, and they're working towards removing that. Now, double tap to zoom usually is only useful when you can actually zoom a page. So browsers have started optimizing things away. So one of the things that browsers like Chrome and Firefox are doing is, if your site is already saying through the viewport of using the CSS equivalent of the app viewport, if you're already saying as a developer, don't let this page be zoomable, so use escape or no, that 300 millisecond delay isn't there anymore. The browser effectively, once it sees that, it doesn't wait the extra 300 milliseconds, because double tap wouldn't actually do anything. You can't zoom in the first place. So that's Chrome, same thing for Firefox. Variations of the theme, I might not say it's not scalable, but if I say minimum and maximum scale are the same effect. So no delay in Chrome or Firefox. For the longest time, Firefox OS had a problem with that, but I found the bug and it's been resolved. That was when I tested it in 1.1, so I think from 2 or 3 onwards, that kind of optimization is in Firefox OS as well. Usually I say for the other 10 people that use Firefox OS. But I didn't, I'm being nice. Now, what about accessibility? Saying a page can't be zoomed is probably not the best practice for somebody who does actually need it zoomed because they've got low vision or something like that. That might not be ideal. Again, it's a very heavy-handed way of just removing a delay by preventing any user from actually doing anything to the page. Well, some browsers have a setting in their settings where you can force zooming. So even though the website says, yes, this is user scalable, no, the user can go in and say, no, I want to force enable zooming. Once you do that, the 300 millisecond delay reappears, which seems a fair compromise. By default, you remove the delay, but you can't zoom. If the user really needs to zoom, they can enable it, but they have to live with the 300 milliseconds. The problem with that is that not every browser has that particular option in their settings. I think Firefox doesn't, for instance, on Android. So it's not the ideal situation. Now, particularly the Google team, the Chrome team have worked really heavily on looking for alternatives. Any other situation where they can automatically remove this 300 millisecond delay. And one of the recent-ish changes that they've made, well, I say recent, it was December last year, is from Chrome 32 onwards, if the site actually says width equals device width in the meta viewport, which generally assumes that this is a mobile optimized site, they also remove the delay, and they basically remove the ability to double tap to zoom. Now, a lot of people complained about this, like how can you make that assumption? I still want to be able to zoom, even though it's width equals device width. All they've done is they've removed double tap to zoom. If you really want to zoom, you can still do pinch zooming with 2 fingers. That's still there. Arguably, that's a fair compromise. And the same thing in Mozilla as well. So Firefox on, I think, desktop and mobile, they will also have this optimization. So width equals device width removes the 300 millisecond delay because it suppresses double tap to zoom. Now, the odd one out is obviously iOS Safari. Any of these optimizations that I just talked about, which are nicer than having to mess about with prevent defaulting and doubling up event listeners, they're nice, but none of that stuff works in iOS Safari, which is a shame. So I found a bug ages ago asking, basically, can we have these optimizations that pretty much every other browser is doing? And the answer was, I don't know, how many of you have got iPhone, iPads? Show of hands, I won't shame you. Cool. How many of you know of double tap to scroll? Any of you? Oh, well, it's your fault then. That, well, one of the features that iOS Safari has, which is not documented anywhere, and so no users really stumble across. Well, they stumble across it. They never read about it. Is even if the page isn't zoomable, you can double tap and it scrolls to the position that you double tapped. So that was one of the reasons that was given for no, we can't possibly do these optimizations because that would kill this really valuable feature that nobody knows about. So that's a shame. So after seeing all the nice things for all the other platforms like Android, you can do this start Firefox OS. You will still have to do some kind of use fast click or use like prevent default and everything else. Right, so that's probably the chunkiest part of this presentation. You'll be glad to hear. It's now all a breeze from this point on. So we've seen the problem with the 300 millisecond delay and how to work around it with touch. Now we're going to go to the fact that mouse move doesn't track. So we've seen the example. I can do it with the mouse. I move my finger around the screen and nothing happens. Now, the reason why only when I tapped and released the finger quickly, some of the bubbles popped in my demo, was that as part of the entire event sequence, it fires that one mouse move. So after I release the finger, 300 milliseconds, if I haven't optimized them away, and then the various mouse events fire, and there's a single mouse move. Now, I usually call that a sacrificial mouse move, because it's only there for compatibility with websites that still listen for that sort of stuff. To do things like, I don't know, certain types of menus rely on that particular event. But it's only a single one, regardless of how much movement there is, it will only ever fire one. Now, so how can we know that there is a touch move, which actually fires continuously as I move my finger around the screen? So, naive solution, as we've seen before, we'll listen to mouse move and to touch move. So this is the very basic, it's actually not far from the real code that I use for my demo, the very basic code that will assume we're listening to mouse move, it then fires on every movement, it fires that position handler, and that position handler gets the X and Y coordinates of nominally where the mouse pointer is, and then does the, pop the bubble at that particular point. So if I just double up the event listener, let's say, and I've got mouse move and touch move, still firing the same function, I'll very quickly see that it still works on mouse, obviously, but as soon as I start doing touch, nothing really happens. And the problem is because I'm trying to read out the X and Y coordinates from the event object that I'm getting back, as we've seen in that previous slide. Now, without going into too much detail, and this is a bit like going back to school, when we get, we listen to a mouse event, the event object we get back contains all these various coordinates, screen X, screen Y, client X, client Y, and then with the mouse event extension spec, you also get the slightly weirder page X, page Y, X, Y, offset X, offset Y. Basically, long story short, when you're listening for a mouse event, you get an object back that has an X and a Y coordinate in various shapes and sizes. If you're listening to a touch event, you don't get back any coordinates in the actual event itself. What you get back is a whole list of new touch list objects. So you get touches, target touches, and change touches. And then in those touch list objects, you actually get individual X and Y coordinates for pretty much the touch points on the screen. Now there are a few differences between these three touch list objects. Touches is a bit of a super global, so it's a weird thing. So even if I'm only listening for events on, in my usual examples, that button, even if I then have a finger completely outside of that button, so nothing to do with firing events on that particular button, in touches I can see those coordinates as well. So it's kind of a super global of wherever I'm listening, I know how many fingers are on the web page. Target touches are all the touch points that started on this event. And by started, I mean I tap down, say, on the button, and that will be target touches because I'm only listening on there. Even if I now move that finger outside of the boundaries of the button, as long as it's still down on the screen, I can still keep tracking that particular one. And then change touches, in effect, is what fired, what caused the events that I'm now reacting to fire in the first place. And again, it's almost a subset of target touches. I'm listening on the button. Change touches will be that finger just went on the screen, that's changed, or went on the button, that's changed, that's now in change touches. If I lift the finger, there will still be a reference to the last position of that finger in change touches. So it's always what am I reacting to, what caused the events that I'm now working on to fire. If you're more of a visual person, you can go and have a play with that. I made it kind of more visual with circles and stuff because I only can do circles. I'm a fantastic graphic designer. If circles are your business. So, long story short, with all these X and Y and touch lists and everything else, is that you can't just take your code that you used to run for your mouse handling with the X and Y. You need to do a little bit of forking inside your code. Fork that code. And you need to look at, if it's a mouse, basically, you can, business as usual, or, X and Y in the event object that you get. If it's touches, you need to start working on those touch list objects. Now in this particular example, I just look at target touches, and I made a very naive simplification by saying, I'm only going to react to a single finger, and that will only be, it's like an array, that will only be the position 0 of target touches. So I'm not doing anything clever with multi-touch or anything like that. And then I need to fire prevent default, because I want to avoid that, once I lift my finger, if there wasn't a lot of movement, that it fires this again. So a lot of work just to basically double up and fork your code to do stuff. But then, I can make it actually work. Super quick demo time. So we saw before that was the one that only went with mouse. Now this one goes with mouse, but it also lets me do things with a finger. Now, we can track a finger. We now have a way of saying, okay, well, we follow the coordinates that are changing. The next logical step is, from that, we can do swipe gestures from basic principles. Now, this is nothing new. We've done that for mouse events type stuff years ago. Also mouse trails or, snowflakes, that kind of stuff. But, all we need to know is, we look at how much, I moved from the moment I touch the screen to the moment I lift my finger again, what's the delta x over delta t for time. If it's within a certain threshold, I'll assume that was a swipe to the left, swipe to the right. So, you can start making use of this, this information as well. You can make something a little bit more useful as well, like picture sliders. Yeah, there we go. So, it's a little bit broken, this one. But, you can do stuff like that as well now, which is kind of more touchscreen specific. But don't forget about mouse and keyboard. I spent probably about 5 minutes before showing you that there are devices that are hybrid, that have got multiple inputs. So something that, it's great that you can say, oh, I can make all my carousels swipeable now, or everything like that. Still offers some way for a mouse or keyboard user to operate it. And a nice example, I'm hoping I'm like that, yeah. A nice example of that, Brad Frost, just a cool kind of responsive web design. He made a little demo site. It shows a lot of things, it morphs as you change the viewport and everything else. But he's got this little, it's a shop, it's got a few pictures of these, of this t-shirt. Works great with a mouse. It works also with a keyboard if I started tabbing and get to the various thumbnails and activate them. but it also lets me do swiping. So look at it more like a progressive enhancement kind of thing, rather than saying, I'm only going to make a touch version of this, or I'm only going to make a touch-specific optimization. Start thinking about ways of doing both. Now, touch move fires a lot, similar to mouse move if you track that. So really what you want to do is do the absolute minimum, particularly if you're targeting slightly older devices. They might not be super powerful, and if I'm tracking touch move, it fires about 100 times a second. I don't want to be doing loads of heavy calculations and drawing to canvas and whatever, the Pythagoras calculations in there, because you'll quickly end up either draining the user's battery, or it's going to have loads of backed up events and start becoming really, really sluggish. So try to do the absolute minimum on touch move. Usually that's the absolute minimum, is just store the coordinates. And then do the actual, drawing or calculation or anything like that on set interval or request animation frame. That just gives you a bit more control of when the heavy stuff is actually happening. And don't try to do it 100 times a second, basically. If that's still not enough, you can start looking at options like debouncing or throttling events. Here, just use a simple thing called limit.js. There's variations on this, but depending on what you do, if absolute precision is essential, you probably do want to track every single movement. But if all you're trying to do is a swipe or something like that, maybe you can start listening only to every fifth or every sixth touch move. That just immediately makes it a little bit lighter on the device to use. And then why stop at a single point? We've seen we can track a single point, we can do swipes. You can also work through multiple touch points at the same time. As we've seen, we get these lists, these touch list objects, touches, target touches, change touches. We can work through them, like it's a collection or whatever it is. You can work through them in a loop, and just get the X and Y coordinates of every single touch that you've got on the screen. And you can do absolutely futile things like this. It's multi-touch. Cool stuff. And here I've just skipped ahead by a few things. Now, we've seen before, prevent default is kind of our magic tool to say I'm handling all these touch things myself in my code. Now, it wouldn't be web development if there weren't browsers that do weird shit and prevent you from doing stuff. So on iOS, on iPad, there are kind of OS level gestures built into iOS. One of them is 4-finger swipe to go between applications. You cannot override that. So as soon as you try to do anything that uses more than 3 fingers, even if you prevent default or anything like that, you will not be able to override changing from one application to the other. The photo's a bit dark, but yeah, it's a little canvas thing, and I'm already swiping to the next application. Similarly, iOS 7, when it first came out, was great because it introduced the idea of if I swipe from the corners of Safari, I can go backwards and forwards in history. It's like a time machine. However, that again interferes completely with, if you're doing anything that tries to track finger motion towards the edges of the screen, even prevent default won't override those. So again, it's a bit of a pain. Just use it carefully. We've seen multi-touch gestures. That's basically culminates in that as well. And now, yes, it's cool. We can track multiple fingers as well. We can look at gestures like rotation and everything else. However, be careful because, again, there are devices, not all devices, even modern ones or recent ones, support multi-touch or multi-touch up to a certain point. Now, my venerable HTC Hero, yes, it's quite old, Android 2.1. If you put more than one finger on the screen, only the first one is tracked, because on the OS level, it only recognizes a single finger and sends that to the browser, which is annoying. LG Optimus 2X, I'm going through my history of devices. I only include it because it does something quite interesting. If you put more than one finger on there, it averages between whatever fingers you've got on there. So 2 fingers and it thinks I'm touching right in the middle. So yeah, it's limited, but it tries to do something clever. ZTE Open, Firefox OS. The device itself, I mean, we're on the lower spectrum of hardware, which is understandable. It supports 2 fingers. And that's fine because the majority of things is pinch to zoom, rotate and stuff you can do with 2 fingers. But as soon as you put a 3rd finger, 4th finger, etc., it doesn't recognize them. So the takeaway isn't, some devices are crap. The takeaway is be careful because, don't assume now that you can put all this functionality in your websites now that, I've got touch, I will force the user to use 5 fingers and the elbow to go to my next blog post. Use with caution. How much time have I actually got? Because I'm now completely lost. Yeah? Carry on. Vince, you still with us? Sorry. Right. So, we've seen, I've spent ages talking about these touch events invented by Apple. All other browsers implemented them, with one exception, which is IE. And I don't blame you for laughing, because that is usually the way it goes with IE, isn't it? There's a new technology, they never implement it. So up until IE 9, which is kind of Windows 7, Windows Phone 7.5, you only had to deal with mouse events. So even in the developer documentation for Windows Phone, they talk a lot about how to optimize websites to run on Windows Phone. In their version of IE 9, which is kind of a bastardized version of IE 7, I seem to remember, with some extra bits, it only ever talks about how to deal with mouse events, which had, as we've seen at the very start, problems and limitations. And you could never do anything multi-touch anyway, because all you ever relied on was the single mouse emulation. Now in IE 10, instead of also adding touch events like every other browser did, Microsoft did something that at the time I thought, here we go again, invented a completely new event model, which is the pointer events model. Now, as I said, at the start, I was a bit skeptical, like pretty much everybody else, but I've actually grown to like them because they make a lot of sense, and hopefully I'll sell you on them in the next few minutes as well, or next few hours. Because we've seen that even just to have my code run for mouse and touch, there's a lot of fucking about that I have to do with prevent defaulting, forking my code. I need to either look for the coordinates in the object or I need to go into the touch list. There's a lot of extra stuff. And we're only now scratching the surface. There's more input modes that are slowly coming on as well. And it's just not sustainable to basically say, for every new type of input that is slightly different or brings something new, we'll have a completely separate event model. So what Microsoft did, particularly because Windows 8 at the time, was already gearing up to be, touch and stylus and keyboard and mouse and everything else, they kind of went back to the drawing board and invented pointer events as kind of an umbrella event model, which kind of coalesces all these different types of inputs into one single event model. Rather than having to fork my code, double up event listeners, I can listen to only one, and it covers all these different situations, which actually makes a lot of sense. So yeah, it's not just a not invented here technology. It's not just Microsoft saying, well, we'll make our own proprietary thing that then people will just code for IE and will win the web. They actually, as soon as they released it, they did the right thing and also submitted it as a candidate recommendation to the W3C, which is nice. So compare that to Apple, who basically released it and it was only later retrospectively spec'd by somebody else. And Apple actually made a bit of noise at the time about, this might be patented and you might not be able to do it. And it was resolved in the end, but yeah, that wasn't the nice way. So the Microsoft team, the IE team, actually submitted this to the specification at W3C. And yes, I am biased because I'm also now part of the working group that's working on this. I'm trying to, a lot of the work I've been doing is editorial, trying to make sure that things that are implicit in, like, here's the algorithm, I usually say, well, there is some implicit stuff here, let's just write a sentence that somebody, like a normal human being, reads the spec and can actually understand. So yeah, I am biased when I start talking about this. So the first version of the pointer event spec was done, I think last year was submitted. It's now work is carrying on the editor's draft, which is where I'm kind of messing about at the moment as well. And when they released IE 10 and pointer events, the Microsoft team also did a proof of concept Chromium build, so Microsoft doing open source, and hell is getting quite chilly. But, it proved the point. It wasn't perfect, and it's far from perfect from my tests. But they just said, well, here's how we envisage, say, WebKit at the time, supporting pointer events as well, in a very basic way. And other browsers are now actually looking at pointer events and hoping to roll them out. So Chromium, so the Google team, so something that will make it into Chrome, hopefully. are actively working on pointer events, and the same at Mozilla. Also, Firefox will see probably pointer events land at some point. Now again, what about Apple? Well, Apple are Apple. Implement pointer event resolved won't fix at this point anyway. So we'll see. Apple are not quite happy because they didn't invent it. I don't know. So looking at, we know that this classic example, I can't do anything else. Buttons. When do these pointer events fire? What does it actually look like? This kind of new event model. Well, it looks a little bit like this. So if I tap on a button in a browser that supports pointer events, I get a mouse move, which again is kind of the sacrificial mouse move that we saw before. It's purely there for compatibility reasons. Kind of ignore that one. But after that, you get something that actually makes a lot of sense. Rather than seeing, like we saw before, touch events, then a delay, and then mouse compatibility events, this is actually running them intertwined. You get pointer over, mouse over, pointer enter, mouse enter, pointer down, mouse down, pointer move, mouse move, etc. So you see that there is pretty much a one-to-one mapping between what you would know as a mouse event and the equivalent pointer event. So it fires exactly something that you would expect even for, say, tapping on a touch screen. There's a few other details involving pointer capture. I'm not going to go into that, but I've got a link later on for those who really want to have a look at that. Now the mouse events only fire for a primary pointer, which means that similar to touch events, it's if I only got one finger on a touch screen in particular, it fires mouse. As soon as I do a 2-finger or 3-finger tap, it will not fire these because it assumes, again, like with touch events, that's not really a tap that I'm doing, but something else, some kind of gesture, etc. But in general, the event order makes a lot more sense because it's pretty much what we know from mouse events, just with a slightly different syntax. Now in IE10, it's vendor prefix when it came out. So you have to do, weird, uppercase, camel case, MS, pointer down was the events, and then there's various other things, all prefixed with MS. In IE11, which is now fairly common out there, even on Windows Phone 8 and Windows 8.1, it's been unprefixed, so you can actually use it as per spec. It still understands the prefix versions, just in case you already have some code that did the MS, pointer down, etc. But that's only for compatibility just now. We've seen that before we had, say, for mouse events, you have a certain event object. For touch events, we had a completely different event object, then with a touch list and everything else. Well, what pointer events does is, rather than, again, invent a completely new event object, they just extend the mouse event object. So you get exactly what you would be, normally used to from reacting to a mouse event. You get exactly the same, client X, client Y, blah, blah, blah. Plus, it extends that, and you get, touch-specific stuff. It gives it an ID, so you can actually identify individual touch points for multi-touch interactions. Also, it has things for, if you're doing stuff for a stylus, you can test, the pressure or the tilt, how is the stylus tilted, that sort of stuff. There is a simple feature detect for pointer events. We saw that before, how you detect touch events. Simple stuff. If window pointer event, if that property exists, you can assume that the browser supports pointer events. Now, critically, it's not as kind of narrow as this browser supports touch events, which is only there if there was a touch device. Pointer events still covers, mouse, stylus, and touchscreen. So you can still, at that point, assume all of those could be there. It doesn't lead developers, hopefully, down the wrong conclusion of this is a touch device or not. You still have to do special stuff for keyboard. That was one of the things I've tried to push through was, can we not also include keyboard under this big umbrella of events? But there was a bit of disagreement if keyboard, like tabbing from one element to the next and hitting enter, if that counted as being a pointer. I would argue it is, because it's a way of even graphically saying, I'm interested in this particular thing. But, I lost that battle. But in the end, I got a note added to the spec that basically reminds developers that, still, do this whole pointer stuff, but still think about the children. Now, think about the keyboard users. You can also do interesting things like detecting what the hardware says the maximum touch points are. So if the hardware doesn't lie, you can detect, okay, the problem we saw before with some devices not supporting more than 2 fingers or whatever. If the hardware doesn't lie, you can actually tell exactly. A, there is some kind of touch screen. If it's got more than 0 touch points, you can assume there is some kind of touch screen involved. And if it's more than 1, it's also multi-touch capable, that sort of stuff. Now, are pointer events better? I'm going to try and rattle through this really quickly. We've seen, as I said, all the problems we had before. Now, with pointer events, you don't need separate listeners. Once you start listening to pointer events, you're already covering, touch, stylus, and mouse, and trackpad, that sort of thing. So you just do one listener rather than having to double them up and do for touch and for mouse, and then doing prevent default and everything else. No need for separate, forking in your code to get the X and Y coordinates, because, as I said, pointer events extend mouse events, so you get the X and Y coordinates as you would expect them with mouse. So if you've got code that relies on mouse event handling, in most cases you can just swap out the event handler for pointer, and it will automatically work with stylus and touch as well, depending on what you're doing. But if you really, in your code, for whatever reason, for usability or whatever, want to distinguish, was this a finger, or was this a mouse, or was this a stylus, you can, because as part of the extended attributes in the events that you get with pointer events, yes, you get all the stuff that you've got with mouse, but you also got pointer type as an attribute. And you can basically do really naive, this is all in the spec. I've included, I think, pretty much this exact example as well. You can do a switch and say, well, if it was mouse, do this. If it was touch, do this. If it's stylus, do that. Still have a default, just in case at some point some device comes out that invents a new input, but also fires pointer events. But in general, you can basically have the best of both worlds. You can have exact same code, runs exactly the same way, whether it's a touch screen or a mouse or a stylus, or you can do input-specific stuff as well. Now, super quick, you still have the same problems that we saw before with touch screens, event delay, click delay, basically 300 milliseconds, and just mouse move not tracking. How can we solve that? So if I try this on my Windows laptop here, I press the button, I still get a 300 millisecond delay. Particularly because on Windows, even in IE, on a touch laptop, it lets me double tap to zoom. Something that Chrome doesn't do on desktop on Windows 8, but IE lets me double tap to zoom. So it has that 300 millisecond delay. Now we can look at the entire event order as well, but basically the delay, where does it happen? It happens right before the click. So we saw that it does this interleaving pointer, mouse, pointer, mouse, pointer, mouse, pointer, mouse. Then it waits 300 milliseconds and then it fires the click. So it fires it at a slightly different location. How can we make it more responsive? Well, we could try to do what we did before. If you remember, it was react to any kind of event upstream from that 300 millisecond delay. But that starts getting a little bit hairy. So you double up your event listeners, say pointer up will be a good candidate, the fingers removed from the screen. And doing pointer up and click, because we don't want to make it specific to that particular model. Prevent firing the code twice with prevent default. We can try that, but prevent default doesn't actually prevent the click event from firing, because it's not considered a mouse compatibility event. If I prevent default, it stops pretty much the majority of the mouse events, but click is still fired, because in the pointer events model, click is slightly special. However, there is a CSS attribute that is also defined in the pointer event specification. So bear with me, it sounds again a little bit weird. Why do I use CSS to define stuff? Purists will disagree, but basically it's a CSS property, and in that I can define what is the default behavior, the default handling that the browser should do for this element. But if I do it for HTML or for body, it applies to the entire page, or I can be very surgical and say just for, say, that button. So auto means, the browser handles everything. Double tap to zoom, I can pinch zoom, I can scroll and everything else. But I can also say none, which is kind of the bit, oops, kill myself. It's the hammer equivalent. I've lost it completely, I'll find it later. It's the big hammer. See, that's how excited I am about pointer events. You're basically saying, no, I'm going to handle everything myself. You can also say, well, the browser should just let me pan, it should handle the scrolling. Or the latest one is manipulation, which is kind of a halfway house, which says, in effect, the user can do everything they want, they can pinch, zoom and stuff. The only thing that is basically prevented with manipulation is double tap to zoom, which is kind of what we want. Now again, touch action none. It was my throw the remote away in anger. It kills scrolling, it kills long press, pinch to zoom. Again, use it surgically. Touch action manipulation is really what you want if all you want to do is removing that 300 milliseconds delay. So applying that to my test button, I see that there's no delays. Click fires right away, there's no 300 millisecond delay. So if that's what I was trying to do, a single bit of CSS pointed at, say the button in this particular case, actually solves my worries. And this approach is actually quite clean, and even though we're a bit away from having pointer events as a full spec in, say, Firefox, Mozilla are rushing through to actually implement just that particular aspect. So that this will be another way of an author to very explicitly say, basically, kill that 300 millisecond delay. So they're actually trying to implement just this touch action manipulation part and react to that. Same thing in Chrome, they're also trying to at least have this right away. And I think that's actually on track to come out very soon. You can already enable it in Chrome 35 on mobile if you enable the experimental flag. Oops, what was that one? Oh yeah, we submitted that again to WebKit, hopefully Safari. They're not as averse to this particular thing. They don't like pointer events as a whole, but they are talking about this, that this could be implemented, perhaps. The fact that mouse move doesn't track, we have exactly the same problem. I'm not going to bore you with a demo. I can just apply touch action none to that particular page, because the problem was as soon as I start moving my finger, I'll show you the demo. Sorry, Vincent. So here it is. Once I start moving my finger, I'm already triggering the scrolling and everything else. So by just adding touch action none, I'll basically say, don't do anything. I've only applied to the canvas, so I can still do the scrolling outside of the canvas. I think, yeah, I can pinch zoom. But as soon as I'm in here, I'm basically saying with touch action none, I'm handling everything that happens touch-wise in this particular area. And then all of a sudden, without triggering any scrolling, this actually works. What about multi-touch? Those super globals that we saw before, like the touch list object, which shows me everything, or target touches, or change touches. Obviously, we don't have that with pointer events. We have to build them from basic principles. It's not too difficult. Just keep track of when something, a pointer is down, a pointer is moved, a pointer is up. You can recreate them yourself, and you can end up with simple things like this. So you can track multiple fingers, and at the same time with the same code, I can also track the mouse. And if I had a stylus now, I could use my mouth to do that as well. And what you might have noticed is some of these have two circles. I use that to identify what's called a primary pointer. Now, on a mouse, the mouse pointer itself is always primary. Because you usually only have one mouse on a device. Once I start using touch, the first finger that touched the screen is considered the primary pointer. And that's the one that usually fires, the only one that fires mouse compatibility events, etc. It's kind of the more important one. But importantly, because I can have more than one input type, there can be more than one that are primary. So just something to look out for. Backwards compatibility will still be a nightmare. Browsers are working towards having pointer events, but because the model is so different from touch events, there's still a bit of discussion about how can a browser support both events, because they do the delay at different points, the whole order of things is different. That's still not 100% sure. Some browsers are talking about they might apply heuristics to a page and see if the page registers pointer events, ignore touch events, or vice versa. That's being worked on in another W3C community group. I'm also part of that. there's no real answer at the moment. You know, if you really want to be future-proof and backwards compatible, it looks a bit like this, which is a monster, obviously. You can start saying, if it supports pointer events, I'll handle pointer events. Otherwise, I do the doubling up of mouse and touch, and it's a real mess. And I still need to do keyboard in any case for both situations. There are polyfills that you can start using today if you really want to start using pointer events. Ham.js is actually done by Microsoft, again as part of when they released IE 10. It's not bad. You know, there's examples out there. For instance, Firefox doesn't have pointer events yet, but with Ham.js, you can basically code as if it was there, as with any polyfill. So you can start listening to pointer up, pointer down, etc. It even parses your CSS to look for touch action, just in case it's there. It does the special handling of that. If you like your frameworks to be 80 gigabytes, you can use Polymer. I jest, but not by much. You can use Polymer, which is kind of Google's mega kind of polyfill that brings the web of 10 years from now to our browsers today. There is a pointer events module in Polymer as well. Although, because Polymer, the whole theory behind Polymer is everything is element-based, they don't like the touch action being in CSS, so they kind of introduce a slightly non-standard touch action attribute that you apply to your actual elements. So it's not completely interoperable if you want to just use either that or, say, Ham.js. But, it gives you a way, again, of playing with things. There are also utility libraries, because life is too short to code your swipe gestures and stuff by hand. Best one I've come across is Hammer.js, because you can touch it. I know it's a fantastic code, isn't it? Really quickly, so it's changed the design of the website. But yeah, it basically does what I did before from basic principles. You can look at my code, and then this is a lot more abstract. It lets you actually write event listeners that are more kind of slightly higher level, so you can react to swipe left or a swipe in general, which makes it, I think, a little bit nicer, because in most cases as a developer, which is kind of the idea behind pointer events as well, I don't really care how a user interacts with certain elements, I just want to know what their intent is. They swiped, I don't care that a finger or a mouse went down and then it moved by 100 pixels over 30 milliseconds and then calculate what that means. I just want to know, okay, they swiped or they double tapped or something like that. So this kind of brings one level of abstraction higher, which is quite nice. Obviously, big ones like jQuery Mobile, Cinch Touch, I think in general they're actually quite good. I've not tested them very specifically for things like, do they support actual pointer events, but I hear that at least jQuery Mobile does. Debugging and testing, super quickly. Pretty much all dev tools nowadays now give you the option of, say, remote debugging stuff, or even emulating things directly. Say, I don't have a touch device that I want to test on, as unlikely as it might sound. They have emulation, but beware inaccurate emulation. So things, which one is this? Oh, I'm getting confused. Is this Chrome DevTools? Yes. Chrome DevTools, you can enable touch emulation, but be careful because it actually doesn't fire exactly the same sequence as a real device. So again, don't take what you get from this testing to be, I will always get this event, then that event, because it's not quite right. So I filed a bug against that. That should be resolved soon. Oh yeah, it was fixed in Chrome Canary 37, the last I heard. Same deal in Firefox. Firefox DevTools have touch emulation as well, but they still fire a few remaining mouse events as I'm kind of moving over the emulated touchscreen, which they shouldn't. So again, I filed a bug against that. You can tell Friday nights at my place are parties on, just firing bugs. Beware inaccurate implementations. So as an example, Firefox, they don't officially have neither touch events nor pointer events in their actual, say, Windows version of the browser. You can enable them in the flags, but they do weird stuff in terms of the event order and, say, the objects you get back, etc., are very far from actually being true to a real device. And then if all of this, my 6 hours of talking wasn't enough, you've got a few more links if you can't sleep. And then with that, I'd say thank you very much, and thank you very much.